As of Monday, September 23rd, the Kansas Jayhawks have been the most disappointing team in college football. After starting out ranked in the top 25, Kansas football felt on top of the world. For nearly a decade, they were considered the worst Power 5 program in all of college football, went through coach after coach, had some scandal at Les Miles, and they were honestly pathetic. Whenever they won a conference game, it was a huge deal, but once Lance Leipold came in, everything changed. Kansas was tough to beat, they were beating ranked teams, they were putting up points, and they were a respectable opponent. Led by quarterbacks like Jason Bean and Jalen Daniels, the Jayhawks finally had good quarterback play, and that's part of the reason why they're ranked going into 2024. The Jayhawks returned one of the best running backs in the country in Devin Neal, had a good receiver core, a good defense, a good coach, and everything was lining up for another good season. The key was having Jalen Daniels stay healthy. While there were some question marks after losing Andy Kotelnicki to Penn State, many thought that Kansas would be just fine. Well, as of today, Jalen Daniels is second in the country in interceptions with 7, the Jayhawks are 1-3, and things do not look good in Lawrence, Kansas. In today's video, I want to talk about the quick rise and fall of Kansas football and what the heck has gone wrong for them this year. We're going to go through quickly how Leipold built the program, why they were getting a lot of hype, and then ultimately the downfall this season and what I expect for the remainder of this season. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of college football, be sure to subscribe to the channel, leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover next. Now let's get started and talk about why the hype is over for Kansas football. As many of us know, since the turn of the century, Kansas football has really struggled. They didn't have a winning season until 2005, and that's when Mark Mangino ended up being the head coach there. In 2007, they had their incredible breakout season with guys like Todd Reesing and Aqib Talib, and they ended up losing to Mizzou, but then won the Orange Bowl over Virginia Tech. After going to a bowl game once again, Mark Mangino was fired because of some questionable off-the-field antics, and ultimately they went a new direction. It seemed it also placed a curse on Kansas as Turner Hill went 3-9 in year 1 and then 2-10 in year 2. He got fired. From there they ended up getting Charlie Weis, and he was not any better. They went 1-11 with an 0-9 mark in the Big 12 in 2012, and then had back-to-back 3-9 seasons in 2013 and 2014. Kansas was absolutely pathetic. In 2015, they decided to hire wide receivers coach David Beatty from Texas A&M, and this proved to once again be a worthless hire. Beatty's Jayhawks went 0-12 in 2015 with an 0-9 mark in the Big 12 Conference. In 2016, the team went 2-10, and then in 2017, the team went 1-11. They made some progress in 2018 with the team going 3-9, but ultimately the best part of the Beatty era was the one time they ended Charlie Strong and the Texas Longhorns. Kansas had now gone through 3 coaches, and honestly, it's hard to pick who was the best. The Jayhawks were now futility U like Kansas State once was, and many thought nobody could win there. Well, one guy thought he could win there, and that was Les Miles. After winning a national championship at LSU, Les Miles was a good recruiter and a guy who many were expecting to help build the program. He landed big recruits such as Puka Williams, and at one point even had Keon Coleman and Jamar Chase committed to the Jayhawks. Oh boy, things could have been different then. In year 1 under Les Miles, the team would end up going 3-9, and they did in fact win one conference game. Going into 2020, the Jayhawks had found a quality 2-star recruit by the name of Jalen Daniels, and he was really the only bright spot on the team. Ultimately, Les Miles and Kansas would end up losing all 9 games, and then he ended up getting fired. There was definitely some scandal going on as well, and ultimately Les Miles was run out of town, and apparently he left the program in complete and utter shambles. But that is where we saw the rebuild happen. Because this happened so late in the hiring cycle, Leipold was actually hired on April 30th of 2021. He said, quote, "It's an exciting and humbling opportunity, and this is a day I'll never forget. We're going to build this program through developing players, discipline, and determination. The best days for this program are ahead, and my family and I are ecstatic to be a part of it. I'm ready to get to work and give everything I have to the Jayhawks." So who the heck was this Lance Leipold guy who thought he could build up Kansas? Well, he was a 2-time MAC Coach of the Year at Buffalo and was an incredible coach at Wisconsin Whitewater. He went 109-6 with 6 Division III national championships, and Leipold was a guy who could develop pretty much any program at any place, and it seemed like he was the right man for the job. Kansas, though, would have some struggles at first. They did have Jalen Daniels on the roster, but they ended up starting Jason Bean, a North Texas transfer. Kansas would end up winning their first game in 2021 playing against a terrible South Dakota team, but this was a big deal to them. From there, things were a complete disaster as they got blown out in pretty much all of their next few games, as they got blown out against Coastal, Baylor, Duke, Iowa State, Texas Tech, Oklahoma, Oklahoma State, and K-State. Things were going very poorly for them, but then they had a break. On the road against Texas, Jalen Daniels ended up burning his red shirt and found walk-on tight end Jared Casey for a 2-point conversion, and they won 57-56. This was a monumental victory for Kansas and the best thing that had happened to them in quite some time. From there, they ended up getting some momentum as they then lost 2 close games back-to-back to TCU and West Virginia. They ended up ending the season strong, and they now had a quarterback battle between Jason Bean and Jalen Daniels. True freshman running back Devin Neal had looked tremendous, and Kwame Lassiter had emerged as one of the top receivers in the conference. 2022 is when things would get really good, as their second-year offensive coordinator Andy Kotelnicki ended up becoming one of the bigger names in the country after an insane start to the season. They ended up starting out 5-0 with wins against West Virginia, Houston, Duke, and Iowa State. That Duke matchup was extremely hyped up, and Kansas had now beat 4 Power 5 opponents. The team was ranked number 19 in the country for an insane showdown at number 17 TCU, but ultimately Jalen Daniels would get hurt and they'd lose by a touchdown. From there, the losing would begin. They lost a close one to Oklahoma, lost a close one to Baylor, and then sandwiched between that and a bunch of losses was a win over number 18 Oklahoma State. Ultimately, that would get them to bowl eligibility, and then they'd blow it in their last 3 games to Texas Tech, Texas, and K-State. Neither of those games were particularly close. They ended up playing against Arkansas in the Liberty Bowl, and in that game they lost in triple overtime 55-53, and many blamed Jason Bean for bad execution towards the end of it. In 2022, Jalen Daniels emerged as he had 2,000 yards with 18 touchdowns, and Bean also had over 1,000 yards with 14 scores. Devin Neal broke the 1,000-yard mark, and Lawrence Arnold, Luke Grimm, Mason Fairchild, and Quentin Skinner all had over 400 yards and over 4 touchdowns apiece. Kansas's offense was absolutely cruising. In 2023, Daniels was back, but he would end up getting hurt, and Bean would take over for the remainder of the year, just like the season prior. Kansas would end up getting off to a 4-0 start before they jumped into the polls at number 24. They got blown out on the road by Texas, but then would bounce back with a win against UCF. After a loss to Oklahoma State, Kansas would then have their biggest win of the Leipold era. Against number 6 Oklahoma, KU would pull off the upset, winning 38-33, and the fans would storm the field. After that, they then beat Iowa State on the road and climbed back into the polls at number 16. Sadly, they ended up blowing it, as they then lost to Texas Tech, and then lost to K-State in the Sunflower Showdown. To finish the regular season, they would go on the road and beat Cincinnati before taking care of UNLV in the Guaranteed Rate Bowl. This was a huge deal. The Jayhawks went 9-4, and now they were seen as a normal good Big 12 team. Except a lot would happen going into 2024. Andy Kotelnicki ended up becoming one of the best offensive coordinators in the country at KU, so he left to take the job at Penn State, who desperately needed to get their offense going. The Jayhawks also lost Jason Bean. I know he's kind of a polarizing name, but Bean was very stable and was actually a really good quarterback for them. They now have to rely on Jalen Daniels, who could just not stay healthy. Luckily though, they would bring back Devin Neal as he decided he would return for the 2024 season, and both Lawrence Arnold and Luke Grimm also said they'd come back at the receiver spot. Kansas was seemingly loading up for a really good 2024 season, and besides Jason Bean, the only guy that they really lost that was a big deal was Austin Booker, who was a backup guy who ended up being drafted in the mid-rounds. Going into the season, Kansas was picked to finish 4th in the Big 12 out of 16 teams, and the AP poll had them ranked at number 22. In week 1, they looked good as they beat Lindenwood 48-3, and that's pretty much no different than playing the deaf and blind school, but a win is a win. In week 2, Kansas would go on the road to play against Illinois, and this is where we saw the chaos begin. On the road against the Fighting Illini, Jalen Daniels had a terrible game. While he did throw for 141 yards, Daniels had 3 interceptions. All of these were extremely costly, and eventually Illinois hung around just enough, pretty much burning up all the time in the 4th quarter, finishing with a touchdown and an eventual field goal to go up 23-17. KU was not able to execute on their final drive, and Illinois stormed the field, and number 19 Kansas went down. Okay, yeah, they went on the road and played a tough Illinois team, and that wasn't that big of a deal, right? They were going to bounce back and beat UNLV the following week. Well, unfortunately the answer would be no to that. UNLV would end up coming to quote town, as they aren't actually playing in David Booth Memorial Stadium because it's being renovated, but in Kansas City, many on a Friday night were expecting Kansas to beat UNLV. I mean, UNLV had beat Houston, but no one really expected much out of them. Ultimately, Jaylen Daniels would once again have a pretty bad game. He'd go 12 of 24 with 153 yards and this time had no touchdowns and 2 interceptions. Daniels once again ended up costing them, and their defense screwed around as UNLV stayed around the goal line for practically the last few minutes and got chance after chance until they punched it in, ultimately winning 23-20, and now Kansas was 1-2. This was pathetic. KU should not be at this point. But again, UNLV I guess was a good Power 5 team. They would now need to bounce back in a huge way against West Virginia. On the road against the Mountaineers, Kansas finally looked like they were getting better. The KU offense was finding a little bit of rhythm, but then the rain delay happened. Storms were coming into Morgantown, so they had to evacuate the stadium and go on pause for a couple hours. Honestly, I forgot about the game. I checked the score at one point in the second half and saw that KU was leading, and that West Virginia practically had no chance to win. Except that's where I was wrong. I ended up seeing the score on a ticker later on, and I guess Garrett Green threw a late game-winning touchdown, and Kansas lost 32-28. This is honestly unbelievable. With 26 seconds left, Rodney Gallagher III had that big touchdown, and West Virginia had 2 scores in the last 4 minutes to upset Kansas. The Jayhawks are now 1-3, 0-1 in the conference, and they have to be the most disappointing team in college football this year. But why is that? Well, I've come up with 3 reasons. 1, I think they bought into the hype. The reason why Kansas and Leipold got good was because they had a ton of players who had chips on their shoulder and wanted to win. Those guys were starving, and now all of a sudden they had a taste of success, and maybe they didn't work as hard or maybe thought they deserved something. This seemingly happens to teams that are bad that get good, as the next wave of players just don't understand it the same. The second reason is Jaylen Daniels. Honestly, he has been hurt over the last couple of years, but he just does not look the same. At one point you could have made the argument that he was a legit NFL prospect, but now he's just terrible. He has not gone for over 200 yards in any of these 3 meaningful games, and so far he's second in the country in interceptions. Daniels just looks completely off, and that leads to our third point. Losing Andy Kotelnicki to Penn State was a much bigger deal than I originally thought. They decided to bring in Jeff Grimes, who spent time at both Baylor and BYU, and I remember when Kansas made the hire, there were a lot of people questioning it. No one really thought that Grimes was that great of an OC, and now we see the mess he's made. His system is obviously not clicking with Daniels, the KU offense has been stagnating, and this has messed everything up. Honestly, this KU team had plenty of talent. They returned a quarterback who started for 4 years practically, they returned a receiving room that was super talented, and then one of the best backs in school history. To be putting up these numbers and being this stagnant is embarrassing, and Jeff Grimes is to blame for this. I guess ultimately you have to put the blame on Lance Leipold for not being prepared to lose Andy Kotelnicki, but that's why Kansas sucks this year. They bought into the hype, Jaylen Daniels is damaged goods, and he's being put in a terrible system by Jeff Grimes. That's ultimately why the Kansas hype is over, and you could also just say bad luck. They honestly should have beaten Illinois, they should have beaten UNLV, and they should have beat West Virginia. Despite all these flaws, they were still leading these teams and still in a position to win, but the ball just did not drop their way, and sometimes that happens. Leipold will have to make sure the Jayhawks bounce back, as the season is not quite over yet. They still definitely do have time to turn it around, as they have TCU, Arizona State, and Houston, and honestly, all 3 of those games are winnable. Win those 3 games, and you're back at 4-3. That makes getting to a bowl game much easier, and for now, Kansas fans should just be hoping for a 6-6 season. It's still sad though that Kansas has fallen off, but what do you guys think? If you're a KU fan, what the heck has gone wrong with Kansas this year? What are your solutions to the problem, and what other topic should I cover in my next video? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you want to support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out all my other videos on the end screen. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.